Good morning, students. Today I'm going to talk about the consumer surplus. So we have already seen that how the change in price is going to basically have an effect on the substitution, that is other commodities preference by people, as well as we've also seen that how much they are going to buy the same commodity. So you have, if they purchase the same commodity, uh, then it is actually an effect. We can say that how the income is going to basically reflect, or the price change is going to reflect on the total purchase of. But what the surplus is actually being understood, sorry, the substitution is understood on the other side differently. And earlier, as I said, this analysis was being basically made based on the fact that the elasticity, the responsiveness towards the commodity by others. So now we are going to talk about a surplus. So an important problem in welfare economics is to devise a monetary measure of the gain and loss that individual experience. So when price changes. Now imagine a situation that I am an individual, I have an entitlement, a money which is basically is being treated as my entitlement in that sense. Okay, no, that is now always the case with this case. Okay, and if my entitlement is given, that is, suppose I am going to have 100 rupees in my hand, and I'm going to buy a commodity in a Marshallian sense, my expected payment, that is my willingness to pay for the commodity is 80 rupees, uh, and what I paid is actually only 70 rupees. Then there is a difference. Even though my readiness of buying the commodity is 80, but what I paid is only 70. So this is in fact makes a kind of understanding, which is largely we call it as the surplus the consumer accrue out of his whole process of consumption. So that is why this is very important. And why? Because this the term is in fact very crucial, because of the fact that on this contrary, or seller, they have a tangible kind of uh, you know uh, surplus, which is what is called the profit. Because whatever uh, in a real world market situation, for a seller, it is quite clear that whatever money income which they receive, as well as what they have paid, is what that difference is what is called their surplus, and that is we termed it as profit in that sense, a very simple sense. So a seller is going to have a surplus there, whereas not so what is going to be maximized by a consumer is the question. Therefore consumer theory try to address. So here is what is the Marshallian understanding of the consumer surplus is gained its momentum. Therefore, what is his expected payment and what is his real or her real payment, that makes actually whether the consumer enjoy this idea of surplus or not. So in that sense, it is more or less your utility imaginations and your feel good in that sense. Okay, so that is what is largely, or tangibly say that okay, I'm ready to pay this much, but I'm not. But whatever money you have is actually with you, and the commodity which you consumed has been consumed. So this is largely about a feel good. So this is what is called the consumer surplus in a simple sense. Now, fundamentally, people never ask certain question. So, can two important question as a student, as a researcher, as a teacher, I would always like to ask towards students or researchers. First question is a very important question. So, under the market situation which was being offered largely, or derived all the assumptions and conclusions of economic analysis by Marshall, is purely based on two principal form of market. One is perfect competition, the other one is monopoly. Okay, because this is actually the background in which all kinds of understanding being developed or theoretical formulation were made. Now, therefore, we need to really ask two questions: that what is the kind of consumer surplus under a perfect competitive situation similar to that of a monopoly for a consumer. So these two questions are very important as far as an understanding of economics is concerned in a very what you call real sense. So I'll address this problem later because this is in my mind it's very important. And this is also having some sort of a take on the welfare aspect of consumer. So one way to evaluate the welfare cost of a price increase normally, which is called px0 to px1, would be to compare the expenditure required to achieve utility zero under these two situations. So this is what is normally standard textbooks everywhere you can see follow the same. Expenditure at px0 is equal to e0, which is equal to your expected px of py and u0, and that would be different. If there is a difference between the e0 and e1, then you can say that there is a welfare, so, or what you call a surplus in that. So in order to compensate for the price rise, this person would require a compensating variation. So if there is a change in price, then how much money you have to actually be given to the person to have the original utility is what is called the compensated variation, is always been discussed about. So CV is equal to therefore your UPX1 PY U0 minus EPX0 PY U0. So this is what is your original utility. What does it mean? Original utility. To achieve the original utility, how much you need to basically give it this P1P period to buy the commodity X. So this is a two-way, and to say that how much money you have to compensate, give to people to have the original utility level. So this is what is called consumer. So when you have actually see this is also equal to say how things are going or really working in the real world. For example, in the regular salary people, they do have DA allowance, like the dearness allowance, the price rise which is equated with inflation. But the point is the income rises along with every subsequent years or a quarter or a biannual way. Their income maybe changes or increases at a rate where you fix at DA, that is 3% or 2% depending on the fixation of the government or the system, monetary system. What is actually the whole idea behind it is when you have an inflation of at least 2% or 3% prevails, then you have to ensure that the utility or the commodity which the same person was buying should be basically been met in the T1 period or T2 period or Tn period. So this is why you have the idea of now if realistically somebody looks into the data, then they can have a really different question altogether. A simple example which I can demonstrate logically, that when you have an income increase at a level of 3% in your DA in India, standard employment or government salary may increase a rate at 3%. But if your economy is having actually 6%, for example, is the inflation rate, then what is really having in every subsequent T2 period, T1 period to T2 period, the quantity or the level of utility which the consumer or the incoming earning class get in every year is basically false. That means the real income, in a sense earlier what is we understood in terms of income, the real income of the people falls in due course. So this money has to go somewhere else. So this is what is actually the kind of inflation. If it is not, if it is market driven inflation, then your income is also has to basically increase at a market given rate. But now once your thing is administered in 3% and your inflation is actually running at 3%, then 6%, then definitely there is a deficit of 3%. That means every year the utility of the consumer falls if your income is given or increases at a given pace in that sense. So this is what is actually we need to understand from this whole. It implies that in real world consumer welfare in that sense falls only if this is the situation. Otherwise, what we are trying to convince is that if your inflationary rate is less than what is your dearness rate, the point is that every subsequent year your income is basically getting better and better. That means your welfare is getting better and better. So this is what is actually the kind of understanding which one would have or should have to get out of it. So the microeconomic implication of the theoretical framework is having this thing, where I was actually asked the original question, how the consumer is going to have a surplus in the competition, as well as the monopolies also make sense. So I will come to again that point a little later because it is too early to shoot this problem. So suppose the consumer is maximizing utility. In this case, if you look into the data, the diagram, if the price of good X rises, the consumer will maximize utility at point B, and the consumer's utility falls from U1 to U2. Okay, and you have a compensated variation, which is what has been given here. A consumer could be compensated so that he or she can afford to remain on U1, and this much of money has to be basically pumped in that sense. So there is a difference. So CV is the amount that the individual would need to be compensated in that sense. So the derivative of the expenditure function with respect to the same graph is the following, that is Vx is the compensated demand function. So you have a small change in dou E, which is depends on Px, Py and U0 divided by the change in Pxy, partial change in the Pxy, it means, so which is equal to Xc, Px, Py and U0. So this is what is actually we discussed a while ago, and consumer welfare therefore can be understood that the amount of CV, that is compensated variation, required can be found by integrating all across a sequence of small increment to the price from Px0 to Px1. So all the increment, if you add together, integrate them, then you will definitely get. So that is why this equation, the integral is the area to the left to the compensated demand curve between Px0 and Px1. So this is what is actually the whole idea which we discussed about. Now when you have a kind of situation, if it is Px0 to Px1, that is Px0 to Px1, then there is a sort of, if it is actually a curve, a straight line, we definitely do have a welfare loss from this case. Because a price change generally involves both the income and substitution effect, it is unclear which compensated demand curve should be used. So this is one way of looking at the problem. Do we use the compensated demand curve for the original target utility? Now this curve is in fact looks like a curve of the monopoly, but I'll come to that later, but you keep it in mind. So should be used, and do we use the compensated demand curve for the original target utility U0 or the new level of utility after the price change of U1? So another way of looking at the problem is to ask how much the person would be willing to pay for the right to consume all of these goods that he wanted at the market price for Px0. Now the area below the compensated demand curve and above the market price is called the consumer surplus. This is what is actually being given here. So this portion, that is that Px1, that rectangular space. So this is what is normally been treated in a Marshallian sense of surplus, and the extra benefit the person receives by being able to make market transaction at the prevailing market price. So if you have a demand curve like this, that you have a curve which says that to move on from this thing to that, at a different compensated variations, then you will have, when the price rises from px0 to px1, the actual market reaction will be to move from A to C, and the consumer utility falls from U0 to 3. This is an increase in the price case, and so you have also a sort of a change, that is the consumer loss in welfare, best described when area px1 BP BAP, that BA px0. So that portion is what is called the consumer loss in welfare. So in these two cases, that is the key thing. In two compensated variation, you can understand that, and by area px1 CDP, that is CDPX, yeah, px0 is actually called the surplus. Okay. So is U0 or U1 the appropriate utility target for an individual? That we need to really understand. So we can use Marshall demand curve to see that, and the px1 CA px, that is this portion, that portion seems to be that this portion, px, this portion, A, this portion, okay, this portion, between the size of the welfare loss defined by this CX utility and the XC U1. So we will define consumer surplus as the area below the Marshall demand curve and above price. So this is what is in that sense, it is below the Marshall demand curve, above the price. So this is what is called your surplus in that sense, okay. Or you say, yes, this case, surplus. And this is the welfare loss of that portion. If this is the case, this is the welfare loss. Okay. So demand curve and above, and show what an individual will pay for the right to make voluntary transaction, this price. Now change in consumer surplus measures the welfare effect in that sense, with respect to the price changes. So suppose, now we have to also understand the welfare loss from price increase. That is, suppose that the composite demand function X is given by XC Px Py V, which is equal to OV Py 0.5 by Px 0.5. So this is simply your Cobb-Douglas case, and the welfare cost of the price increases with this number. So what would be the compensated variation? So integration of all this thing. Okay. Now if you assume that V is equal to 2 and Py is equal to 2, then you will get this number. And if we assume that the utility level falls 1 after the price increase uses the level to calculate welfare loss, so you will get this. So it is 4. So you can do this simple arithmetic exercise, basically integration exercise. So if I is equal to 8, so you can change it with any number and find out that what would be the reflection. So this computed loss from or gain from Marshall demand function is compromised with in the two amount computed using the compensated demand function. Now this is basically going to be the end of the thing, but given that, let me ask a few questions which is noted earlier. What would be a kind of the utility consumer surplus when the situation is a perfect competition, as well as under monopoly, perfect monopoly and perfect competitive market? So this is the food for thought for all of you. I will be discussing that in the class. Okay. So thank you. If any case you have doubt, please feel free to ask. With this, let me conclude this session, and the next lecture is going to be on revealed reference, which is a much weighted paper discussion, all of you. And with this, thank you so much.